Hello, everyone, and welcome to Covering Climate Change. This is the first in a series of events to better understand and improve climate change discourse. Thank you so much for joining us. I've got a few housekeeping things to get out of the way before we start our conversation. First, I just want to say that this series is part of a larger research project exploring narrative impact that involves the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communication, the Julie Ann Wrigley Global Futures Laboratory, and the Narrative Storytelling Initiative, all at Arizona State University. So my name is Jake Nelson, and I'm a professor at the Cronkite School. I'm actually filling in as moderator for Stephen Bechelos, who is the founding director of the Narrative Storytelling Initiative at Arizona State, and is also a professor of practice in the College of Global Futures, the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, and the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism. He couldn't be here today, unfortunately, but I'm really excited to moderate what I'm sure is going to be a really awesome conversation. I'm joined by two very impressive journalists involved in climate change coverage. The first is Susanne Rust, an investigative reporter for the Los Angeles Times, who specializes in environmental issues. Before joining the LA Times, she was an editor of Columbia University's Energy and Environmental Reporting Project. She has also received a number of journalism awards, including the George Polk and John S. Oakes Award for Environmental Reporting. And in 2009, she and her colleague, Mike Kissinger, were selected as Pulitzer finalists. Susanne, thank you so much for joining us. We're also joined by Brian Kahn, who is the managing editor of Earther at Gizmodo. He's also the creator and co-host of System Reboot, Gizmodo's podcast about repairing the broken world. He previously worked at Climate Central, an independent organization of leading scientists and journalists, researching and reporting the facts about our changing climate and its impact on the public. His writing has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, Grist, the Daily Co, Mashable, Quartz, Salon, and Yale Climate Connections, and has been cited in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and Slate. Brian, it's great to have you with us as well. Thank you for being here. One last bit of information before I stop talking quite so much. The way this is going to go is I'm going to basically ask Susanne and Brian a number of questions for about the first half hour of this 1 hour presentation. While I'm doing that, I encourage all of our attendees to please submit questions so that for the second half of this conversation, we can turn it into a Q&A with questions coming from all of you. And we will wrap up a little bit before 2 p.m. Phoenix time, 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So, okay, with that all out of the way, let's jump right in. I'd like to start with a question for both of you, which is what motivated you to pursue a career in climate change journalism in the first place? Susanne, can we start with you?
Well, not sure I pursued a career in climate change journalism. I kind of sort of found myself in it. I'm old enough where people were talking about climate change at one point, but it was kind of like a distant rumble. And it didn't start really picking up until, I'd been a few years into the job. But I think it became very clear very early on that this was really an important area to be looking at and writing about and investigating. And I'm actually a researcher by training. I used to study conservation biology in monkeys. So sort of with that frame of mind, thinking about ecosystems, thinking about wild areas. Again, climate change just became something I could not ignore and was actually quite passionate about. So that's, I suppose, my passion drove me.
Cool, thank you. And Brian?
I mean, mine was also a bit of a passion project, I guess, so to speak. I actually came through to climate change journalism sort of a very backwards way. I was in communications, climate communications beforehand, working at a research institution at Columbia. And it was great work. I certainly enjoyed it, but it was a little bit slower than what I wanted to be doing, so to speak. And so when an opportunity came up to work at Climate Central, that's when I made the jump from communications to journalism, which usually we go the other way around. But I thought, hey, like I'll try something different and see how that goes. But what really brought me to the issue is actually, prior to becoming a journalist and a communications person, I actually used to be a park ranger and a big skier. And for me, like what really brought me into the climate, I guess, what got my brain into the climate space was worrying about these resources that were really precious to me, namely snow. and what was going to happen to it. I was a park ranger at Prairie Lake National Park in Oregon, which is the deepest lake in the US. It's beautiful. You should all go visit it if you haven't. And, it relies entirely on snow. And so to watch the snowpack disappear in the graphs that we would show to visitors made me realize, hey, there's a story here, frankly, and I need to know some more of the details. So I went back, got my master's in climate science and policy, and then sort of went down that road to where I am today.
Thank you. Yeah, so I have a question that I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but I feel like it seems that you were both driven by a passion to really focus on these topics that pursued you to do this work. And I'm sure, as you are aware from doing this work, that the same things that are driving you to do this work also, I think, sometimes drive audiences away from consuming this work, because the sense of just how dire the problem is and how difficult it seems to wrap your arms around. What is it, do you think, about yourselves and your interest in this topic that motivated you to dive headfirst into it rather than, continue doing careers that had nothing to do with climate change? And maybe I'll start with Brian and then go to Susanne.
I mean, I think that, once I started that sort of internal feeling of feeling like, oh no, like what's happening to this thing that I care about? I mean, that just started leading down I don't want to say down a rabbit hole, because it sort of actually opened up a whole new world to me. I mean, once you start looking at this one facet, for me, it was snow, right? But once you start looking at this topic, you realize that there is nothing that remains untouched by climate change, whether, it's the natural world, obviously, that was my end, but then, you look at frontline communities living in the shadow of, fossil fuel refineries. You look at people living in the developed world or developing world and the impact of, say, cyclones on them. You look at just, plankton. There's just no shortage of things that are impacted by it. And so for me, that's what really drove me to it was, this one issue that just opened up an array of things to cover. And as a journalist, I mean, that's both, in some ways it's daunting because there's no shortage of stories to tell. And it's exciting because there's no shortage of stories to tell. So that's kind of what keeps me going now, is just the fact that, I look at my career and I've had many years to write things I really care about. And I don't really feel like there's anything that's slowing me down now, because the urgency is only increasing and my interests have only grown in that time.
Yeah, I would say, let me say a few things about this. One, when I first started reporting on climate change, it seems like the dark ages at this point. It's like, the mid 2000s, late 2000s, that was still the time where you would hand in a story. I worked at a daily newspaper in Milwaukee and hand in a story, and I would be told by editors I had to show the other side, right? This was the dark age of climate reporting, which was out there for a long time. And I think clearly slowed down, the climate movement, because journalists were beholden to this idea of giving two sides for something that there really weren't two sides for, but sort of it was a hard topic to cover for a long time. I think I finally broke through in it when I decided to approach the climate as an investigation. I'm an investigative reporter. And so when I went to Columbia University, we started looking at ExxonMobil and the big oil companies, and began sort of asking the question that I had, asked of chemical companies and products they made. What did they know about climate change? When did they know it? We did a series of stories in 2015 for the Los Angeles Times. They actually came up yesterday, which was really exciting and heartening at congressional hearings, but, showing that these oils companies had known and they had slowed down research on it, expressed doubt. And that was sort of my real entry into the reporting of climate change. I sort of alluding to something you had said earlier, Jacob. I actually got very depressed. I went through a really hard time after that series came out, because I felt like it was such a slam dunk. Like we had the smoking gun there. Anybody who ever had any doubt about climate change science should have no doubt anymore, because those that were spewing the doubt actually were full believers, right? They were using it within their own research. They were predicting when sea ice would leave the Beaufort Sea, right? And when they could start getting into there. It was really hard for a while, because it felt like we do climate change reporting, but we're only reporting to people who already believe it. We're not moving the needle on it. I do think that has changed. I think sort of the the move away from that early style of reporting of there being both sides. I think the investigative journalism that has gone on in climate change, and I think just sort of the breadth and the depth of the reporting, sort of on every element of life right now. There's sort of no escaping climate change is happening. And I feel a sense, a passion that I hadn't felt for years there. And so in my own personal viewpoint, I almost feel like we're at a renaissance again of climate change reporting. And I actually think it's a really exciting area to be in.
It's such an interesting response. It gets to sort of what we're hoping to understand better with this event, which is what should storytelling about climate change look like so that it's most impactful and most effective in sort of mobilizing the public to really take this seriously. The thing about that question is there's an implicit assumption in it, which is that that is what journalists should be doing with their climate change journalism. So the question I have for you is, what are the goals of your reporting? What are you trying to accomplish when you pursue your climate change journalism? And how do those goals differ from the goals of more traditional journalism?
Do you want to go first, Brian, or do you want me to answer this?
Either or, I'm happy to hop in if you want to ponder for a second.
Yeah, you go, Brian, you go first.
All right. I mean, I have a few things that I think, I don't know. I mean, I don't know if these actually differ from the goals of other outlet or other types of reporting, mostly because I've never done those things. So I guess I can't totally speak to that, but I will say that like in my work, I mean, there are a few things that are really important to me. I mean, one of them is certainly the accountability aspect. I mean, the fact that Exxon New reporting that Susanne was talking about, I mean, that is like amazing ground zero seminal reporting that I think has driven a lot of climate reporting since in terms of accountability and exposing, misinformation. And, it's driven, I think, really when we talk about the renaissance of climate journalism, right? Like there is a whole wave now of accountability journalism that really sort of gets in that vein. And we certainly do a bit of that at Earther as well. I mean, just this past week, we did an investigation into fossil fuel advertising and the major political newsletters that go out in the mornings to be like that have big Beltway readership. And it was looking at that hearing that just happened yesterday to say, what are these companies trying to say ahead of that hearing? So I think, for me, it's one thing is exposing that kind of misinformation. And now what is essentially greenwashing that's happening is really vital to holding these companies to account and politicians that enable them as well. Another side though, too, is I think that it also is really important to get people thinking about the possibilities of what else can exist. When it comes down to it, I mean, the science shows that we really need to change course in a major way. Like everything needs to kind of shift around the world to get emissions down, to have a more just society, and to figure out like, what do we collectively want the world to look like? Because it can't necessarily look the same way. I mean, it could, but I think that we can, probably safely say that there are ways to improve it, especially if we're going to deal with climate change in the process. So to me, I think a big part of that too is opening up people's minds and being able to understand like what those choices are. Not necessarily making them for them and not saying one is right or wrong, but to give people a sense of what the future could look like and why it needs to look different from the present. And, that way, I mean, it's a big part of like having an informed democracy. So those are kind of the two, I think, main areas that are really important to me in our reporting. And I don't know, maybe that's a little different than other beats, but maybe not.
Yeah, I would say I don't feel like I approach climate change differently than I would approach any other topic. I feel like as a journalist, what I do is a public service. And I'm there to inform the public of things that are happening, whether it be malfeasance, whether it's accountability journalism, or whether it's just observations of the world around us. And it's funny, I mean, 10 years ago, I don't think I would have been particularly interested in doing that kind of reporting. I was much more of a, let's go find the bad guys. But I really, as I'm getting older and looking around me and seeing just the tragedy of climate change seems everywhere I look, I think it's my duty to go there and report this to the world. And again, sort of back to that idea of there being a renaissance in climate change journalism, I feel like, again, that comes with sort of a much wider embrace of climate change realism by my readers, right? And the American public in general. And I think for a long time there, we as reporters, if we were reporting on climate change, we would write about the Arctic, right? We would write about the poles, and we'd bring some science and polar bears. And it just seemed like very, very almost repetitive. I felt like I was reading the same climate change stories. The tragedy of climate change is that it's no longer just about a few places. It's no longer just a few things are really indicative. It is everywhere. And so I think just about anywhere you look, you can find a climate change story and it will resonate with people because it's so close to home. I mean, it is home.
Yeah, Suzanne, your point about what resonates with people and how that's changed, it gets to something that I'm also really interested in asking both of you about, which is, what is your impression of the audience for this work, and how has your perception of those audiences changed since you first started doing this work? Suzanne, you sort of alluded to how it feels closer to home for the people that are reading this stuff than it does before, but in what other ways do you feel that your perception of the public and the way in which they respond to climate change journalism has changed since you both started doing this work? Maybe Suzanne, I'll start with you and then go to Brian.
Again, I think the audience has grown. I feel like climate change reporting, 10 years ago, even 5 years ago, almost seemed like a very kind of specialty type of reporting, and it was reported for a specialty kind of audience, people who were seeking news about climate change, and it was not particularly broad. I feel like, again, because here in California, we can all see it, like everything's on fire, right? Like during the summertime, it's hard to breathe here. The heat is unbelievable. I mean, we were just in this huge drought, and then over the weekend we had this atmospheric river come through and fill up half half of all of these reservoirs in just a matter of 24 hours. I mean, it's insane, right? And so I think the audience has gotten much larger for it. And we used to talk about this in climate reporting circles. How do we get this kind of information to people and make it resonate, and how do we get local? There's no difficulty doing that anymore. Climate change is local, and so again, that is something that is so much more apparent than it was 5 years ago, 10 years ago, and along with that, clearly the audience has changed.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I would say the same. Like, our audience has grown quite a bit, and I'd say, one thing I've noticed, at least, so I'll speak to Earther really quick, which folks that are not aware is it's a very climate and justice oriented site. We cover climate change, environmental justice, and energy issues, things like that. And what's been interesting to see is, I started there a little over 4 years ago now, and to start, a lot of interest in our science coverage. So looking at science studies, whether it's sea level rise or ocean acidification, what's going on in the Arctic, things like that. It's really interesting to see that over the 4 years, which is not a super long period of time, interest in studies and like what's happening has in some ways dried up. I don't want to say that it doesn't exist, but I think it sort of speaks to the fact, at least with our audience, who is a very climate interested audience, gets the deal, right? Like, the sea level rise study will come out and say like, hey, we're on track for the worst case scenario. And our audience just says like, yeah, no kidding. Like, we can see that. And so I think that, in a lot of ways has influenced, it's a two-way street. Like, I can see our audience is not responding to this stuff as much. I'm sure that, other sites that do more science coverage, or maybe general interest sites like the LA Times or the Washington Post, are seeing that kind of audience show up to them, which I think is great for people that want to engage with that stuff. But for us to understand our audience, I think what really pushes us forward now is looking at, some of those like more, I guess, like forward-looking solutions, not necessarily like really outlandish, like carbon capture stuff, although that certainly captures people's interest, but like thinking about like, what are the things that we have available right now? We've had a lot of interesting responses to things like heat pump technology, windows, improving air conditioning without planet warming chemicals, things like that. And so to me, that's certainly an area I think that it's exciting to see that people are interested in these individual solutions. And I think for us, it's also really incumbent to tell those stories, but also figure out how we can get people involved in thinking about how do we scale these in a societal context, because it's wonderful that folks want to install a heat pump, but one heat pump is not going to turn the tide. So that's kind of like, I think our challenge for the next couple of years is figuring out how to link up those interesting individual actions with like the societal whole that needs to happen.
Yeah, Brian, I saw your heat pump feature and it looked really, really interesting. And also I felt like as an audience member, I was totally representative of what you're describing, where I was like, oh, something positive-ish, that seems like it maybe is something, a step in the right direction. And this brings me to my next question for the two of you, which is, how do you balance reporting about how awful things are as a result of climate change, along with trying to broaden your readers' imaginations about what the world might look like if there were deliberate steps taken to tackle this issue? So Brian, you've already started to answer this question, so maybe I'll let you go first and then I'll move on to Susanne.
I mean, it's really hard, honestly. Like, I think on this beat, it's very easy to see the bad things that are happening, and there are no shortage of, of bad impacts and bad actors and things like that. So in those stories, I think as journalists, like, we're kind of, in some ways keyed in to tell. It just, those are stories that, are newsy. It's like when the bad thing doesn't happen, that's tough to make a story, right? So it takes a lot more to think about those solutions-oriented stories. It takes a lot more deliberateness on our behalf. Something that I've tried to start with Earther is something called burning questions, looking at like, what are questions people might have about decarbonization or lowering their environmental impact in the world? And then, how do we link that to these bigger sort of trends that need to happen? So that certainly is like one aspect, but it does take like a lot of planning. It takes a little bit of digging, and it takes like, frankly, the effort to think through, okay, like I want to write about heat pumps. I mean, the heat pump feature I wrote, like, I thought it was a pretty good story, but it was a really interesting thing to write about because it was like this technology that has been around for a while, has kind of like not bad rap, but as a rap, it's like, oh, it's a, bespoke thing that only rich folks can afford. And it's not necessarily that anymore. So it was kind of exciting to find like that new angle to be like, what is actually exciting about this? So it, like I said, like it takes some digging, but that kind of work is really important. And I think we really need to do that to balance it out, not just for our readers' sake, but honestly just speaking personally, for my own sake, I can't handle writing about wildfires and hurricanes and, failures and policy level stuff. Like doing that is a real mental toll on me. And so it's really important for me to carve out that time to try to find solutions-oriented stories as well, and not just be constantly on the gloom beat.
So I'm not going to add anything very helpful here. I'm on the gloom beat. I would say, again, most of what I do is go and document these things that are happening. And sort of, I mean, I keep talking about how old I am. I turned 50 this year. So I'm like, it's like a new thing for me. But, I went to the Marshall Islands 2 years ago to look at what was happening there, and, spent about 18 months reporting on it. This past year, I've been following gray whales, but I've got more stories coming out just sort of on the entire Pacific ecosystem. And there's not much I can do with solution journalism there, except to sort of, again, with the photographer I work with, Carolyn Cole, is really to go I sometimes feel like people read stories about what is happening, and it's not surprising, right? We all try to remain resilient in the lives we have, and so we have to do what we can. But you put out a story, and we all get in our cars and go to work, and things are forgotten pretty soon. So what I try to do is try to go to these places in the world, or find ecosystems or animals out there that I feel that resonate with me. I mean, I have to say, this is going to sound ridiculous and probably selfish in some sense, but my audience is me, right? Like, I feel like if I'm driven by something and it excites me or upsets me, or just I can't stop thinking about it, it's going to affect others as well. And it's sort of what keeps me working on these things for as long as I do. So that's what I do. I go out there and I get as much information as I can and try to bring it back and try to tell a story and write a narrative, and bring it as sort of viscerally and visually as I can for my readers. And it seems to work. I mean, in the sense that I do get a lot of reader feedback. This thing I did on gray whales this year, we did a podcast for it through the LA Times, and it was like, unbelievably to all of us, it was the most listened podcast we had had all year. Again, I feel like I'm not very good on solutions journalism, but I do feel, as I've said over and over again in this session, there really is, I think, a growing and dedicated appetite for climate change reporting, observations, and documenting.
Susanne, that's a perfect segue into my next question, which is, what have you learned about what works and what doesn't work when it comes to the climate change journalism that you produce? So you mentioned looking at the reception of your pieces and seeing the feedback that you get. Can you talk a little bit about, what, if any, sort of patterns you have identified about, oh, this got this response, and I think this is the reason why, or this didn't get this response, and here's what I learned from that. Maybe I'll start with you, Susanne, and then go to Brian.
Okay, it's totally unscientific. I have nothing to back it up, right? It's all my gut and sort of what I feel about it. I haven't found anything that I can like really point to say, this is what gets people going. But like one thing I think for sure is, and this sort of goes against what you often hear about the current state of media and the attention span of readers. I find that readers actually, and again, this is probably my sample is people who write to me and tell me this, but people who really appreciate the time and investment that we are spending to tell a story and to tell it well. I think I was raised in journalism at a time where, dead babies were like, in the sense that you always want to have something really, really powerful and frightening and to get people's attention. I don't believe that anymore. I think what really sort of gets people's attention is a really well crafted and thought out story that sort of takes a reader by the hand and brings them somewhere. I'll say, for instance, like when the pandemic began, this photographer, Caroline Cole, who I love working with, she and I drove around the state of California, and we did we went into Yosemite when nobody was there, right? The park had been shut down because of the pandemic. And I mean, the response we got for that, just bringing people to a place that they couldn't be. And in fact, here I'm going to sort of contradict myself. I think one of the things that really got people involved in that story was seeing the world where humans weren't making an imprint finally, right? There was hope that if we just step back, like life will come back. And it was something that really resonated with people. And it's hard to find those places and stories to do. But again, I think just bringing people to places and giving them a new experience and really, really being thoughtful and deliberate about it. It's really not a very good answer, but that's what's worked, and it's really gotten us tremendous audiences for these stories and tremendous feedback as well.
I mean, we've had a very similar, it's funny hearing you talk about the Yosemite vibe. Like I did a story a few years ago where I got to go dig a conservation grave. So I got to go dig a green grave, which was a real trip. And so, we went up, we brought a videographer. I studied photography for undergrad, so I shoot photos for my assignments as well. And, same thing, that story just like it blew up. And I think it was because it just touched a nerve for a lot of people. I mean, green burial is a very hot topic. People seem to really like to read about green burial on our website. Strange niche thing, but true. But it was saying that it was a well-told story. The video piece was absolutely incredible. Our videographer just did an absolutely amazing job shooting it. And despite it being extremely cold and our hands not really functioning at certain points on this trip. But it was a really it was a well-told story with multimedia that really brought folks in. I mean, I think that was a big part of what vibes, but we're a small site. We probably don't have the same resources as bigger newsrooms. I'm guessing hopefully the LA Times provides a little more backstopping for support than we have. But as a result, one of the things that we have to do to sort of find our way in to people's hearts and minds, or to get them to start talking about these things, is actually thinking about how do we become part of a pop culture conversation. It's actually, thankfully, one of my writers on staff is really invested in pop culture. She's a big Bachelor fan. I'm not, but she came in one morning and said, "Hey, I really want to write about The Bachelor and environmental excess in it." And same thing, she wrote the piece, very different vibe, no videography, no, moving stories about people digging green graves, but this really just insightful, incisive commentary on The Bachelor. And ended up getting really, our audience responded. She got tons of email. Crooked reached out and she did a segment on one of their podcasts on The Bachelor, which was wild to me. But I think it's those kinds of things where you can find those little connections to what folks are actually engaged in, in their daily lives, or, whatever it might be. it's really helps to sort of drive home, like if you can find like the secret sort of climate message, good or bad in those things, that tends to really resonate with our audience. And it's something that, I'm like kind of a pop culture Luddite, but I'm really glad that we have folks on staff that are more engaged in those kinds of things and welcome those kinds of stories, because they really do help us, I think, just connect with the zeitgeist and get people to see climate in like literally their everyday lives and the things that they're consuming or they're watching, and being part of that conversation is important.
I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'm going to start drawing from some of the questions that we're getting from our attendees. But that question is sort of touching on what you're both talking about, which is just different ways of telling a story, or different sort of threads you can pull when it comes to reporting on climate change that might appeal to audiences that might not necessarily just tune into a more conventional journalistic approach to climate change. Susanne, you mentioned at the start of this conversation that when you first started doing this work, the journalistic tendency to treat this as a both sides issue was still very much at play. And I'd love for you both to talk about how in your work you have either seen journalistic practices change that you've sort of taken advantage of to make climate change journalism more appealing to a larger number of people, or how you yourselves have challenged those practices and attempted to manipulate them in the service of what you think would be a better story. So maybe I'll start, Brian, with you, and then we'll go to Susanne.
Yeah, so I don't know if this is a challenge per se, but I think it is. So I'll say this is kind of a challenge to, I guess, the status quo. I think in a lot of times, especially with like how climate change is discussed in the political sort of space, is on a left to right spectrum. And I think that, that is the nature of political reporting, right? Is there's the left and there's the right, and like we got to figure out what's happening there. I think that something that I try to do with my reporting, and that is really important in general for us at Earther, is to really not view it as that, but really look at, what does the science say is needed to address this issue? And, not be afraid to call out the fact that the center, politically for climate change is not the center, is not the right thing we should be aiming for, frankly. The reality is that there needs to be radical changes. The science backs up those things, and we know what needs to happen. And we know that, frankly, it's something that has never happened in the history of humanity. We need to draw down carbon emissions at a rate that is just unprecedented. The reason we're at this precipice is because there have been, decades of denial and delay that have been fueled by right-wing politicians and the fossil fuel industry and their enablers. And so that's kind of, I think, when we report on climate change, when we report on what's happening in like the political space and the policies to address it, that is, first and foremost, exactly where we're coming from. And I think in that it creates a very different, hopefully understanding for our readership, because, all too often we refer to someone like, say, Joe Manchin or Kristen Sinema as a centrist, when in reality, what they're asking people to accept as the centrist position is actually a very extreme version of what actually of what the world will look like. If we follow the centrist path on climate change, it leads to a very extreme and, frankly, dangerous and, to me, terrifying world. And so I think, giving our readers the context to understand that and understand, why we report from that space is really important, not just, to me as a person and like being honest in our reporting, but also really important to me as far as informing society about what the choices we actually face are and the stakes of those choices and what we really term as, extreme or rational or whatever it might be. So that's, I think, maybe my biggest form of like pushback, so to speak, in terms of how we report on the issue.
Yeah, and I guess I would say, sort of getting back to that evolution of climate change reporting that's been in there. It wasn't even that long ago where you would sort of have to hedge before an editor would approve it, how you talked about climate change. But climate change reporting came to me to be one of those topics that I cover, again, as an investigative reporter. So like years ago, back in 2008, 2009, I did a whole series on endocrine disruptors. And one of the things I did was I just went through all of the published literature on, research that had been done. So basically on this one chemical, so that I could write with authority. And I think that, in the past 10 years, I refused to sort of write anymore that there was a debate about this. I just wrote about it. This is right. And I would write it with some authority. And I'm not sure I broke any mold doing that, but that is sort of what I did. And I don't think anybody blinks an eye about it anymore. But I can tell you that reading climate change stories now, nobody has to go, most scientists anymore. Climate change just is what it is. And we all write about it like that. It's a matter of fact. I think, thankfully we've gotten to that point so that we can actually write about stuff without sort of hedging or qualifying everything we're saying. And that's a pretty big deal.
I'm going to ask one quick follow-up to that before I get to these questions, because there's something that I think is really interesting about what you said, Susanne, which is just that you can sort of, we've moved on from this as being something that we're debating when it comes to this journalism. It is what it is, and here's the effects of it. But I'm sure, as you both know, that there are people who still don't necessarily agree that climate change is in fact happening. Or maybe they do, and they're just acting in bad faith to pretend otherwise for whatever purposes they might be pursuing. And so I guess my quick follow-up to both of you is, which is sort of the more important goal, to sort of provide the presumably majority of people who understand that climate change is real with the facts that they might need to maybe make changes or to advocate for larger changes to society or to government to actually make the world a more habitable place, or to persuade those who don't necessarily believe that it's real that no, actually this is real and we need to do something about it. Maybe I'll start with Susanne and then go to Brian.
I think at this point, I get reader feedback not infrequently about, me being some part of a cabal, and I'm brainwashed. At this point, really, if somebody does not believe in climate change, I don't think there's much I can do to convince them otherwise. And so, I will keep writing and I will keep documenting what's happening. And, as it's happened, I think there were plenty of people who were, 10 years ago, 5 years ago, even, who were climate change skeptics who have changed their minds, right? As it became so very clear that the world is not what it once was. It's not the world they grew up in. So anybody who is just dug in their feet, there's no changing their mind. This is a thing. Sorry.
I always try to keep in mind, and it's something I teach a course at Columbia in applied climate science policy stuff in the master's program I did. But it's something I talk about a lot with students, is that that group of people is a very small but very loud minority. When you look at this, there's a Yale 6 Americas survey that basically breaks the US into 6 chunks of society and climate beliefs. And the folks that are on the denial end of the spectrum are a small single-digit percentage of Americans. And so to me, I don't really feel like it's my job to convince them. I think it's much more important to inform the people, the vast majority of Americans who are concerned about this issue and want to know what we can do to understand it. I say this with one caveat, which is that I've developed a strange masochistic habit of responding to hate mail as long as it does not threaten bodily harm. And it's actually really insightful in some ways. So I say this I don't need to convince these folks that deny climate change, but those conversations with people tend to be some of the most fascinating things, just because I, say, hey, let's talk about maybe some common ground thing, or, what are you really concerned about? If you're concerned about oil workers, shouldn't we have a just transition for them? I think that's a fair thing that we could ask for, that we could probably agree on, or that you could agree on between the left and the right, or wherever you fall in the political spectrum. And it's amazing how fast it sort of diffuses, I think, that sort of anger and reflexiveness that comes with being able to just shoot off an email to a random person if you disagree with the premise of their article, or you disagree with something that someone else said. So I do say, I say in general, do we need to win over those folks? I don't know that we need to win over all of them, but I do think that there's probably a lot more common ground, and that sometimes, those conversations end up being really great. I've had folks invite me for beers from over in the Permian Basin in Texas. So it's not that they're never gettable, but it's not necessarily the priority of my storytelling.
Yeah, thank you for that, Brian. It's actually, what you're illustrating is basically something that I've noticed just among journalists more generally, which is that there's an acceptance that some people won't necessarily change their minds, and so maybe they should just sort of be left to their own devices. But on the other hand, you want to engage with them because there's always that sort of glimmer of hope that maybe something will happen that'll be positive. Okay, so we're starting to get some really great questions, so I'm going to turn to some of those. The first one comes from Greg Peterson, who's question is, I've been concerned about climate change since the 70s. I do extensive work in the area. And his question is, since you two deal with these topics every day, how do you grapple with, basically, how do you grapple with that with your mental health? Which is a question that I had also, just, we think about this in terms of like the despair that audiences feel. I mean, you are at the front lines of the coverage for this. You can't escape it. How do you cope with what you're covering, and how does that affect your mental health? Maybe you'll start with Brian first, and then go to Susanne.
Yeah, I mean, I honestly don't sometimes. I mean, and that's a problem. This summer when Ida was hitting the Southeast and the West Coast was on fire and the Mediterranean was on fire, and I'm juggling my job and editing 2 reporters for reporting all this stuff. Like, it was really it was hard, like just straight up, like it was really hard, and it was a bad place. And my wife was like, "You're miserable and this sucks for us." And it was bad. Like, I had to figure out how to pull myself out of a tailspin. And I think, the ways that I do that, I mean, sometimes it's as simple as just like walking away from my computer for 10 minutes. Sometimes it's going to the gym and just like lifting as much weight as I can and blowing off steam that ways. Recently started to take up meditation in the morning to try to set myself right for the day. And honestly, like, that's been the biggest thing that's helped. But even then, it's not like I'm immune to days where I feel really, really down in the dumps. Especially like now I'm headed to the UN climate talks next week and already dreading the possibility of a bad outcome there and who knows what. But I think it's kind of coming on, me to find my own coping mechanisms, and also know that, journalism itself is in some ways an outlet to be able to talk about these issues and the stakes and inform people, and know that, even if I'm not having like 10,000 people sending me messages saying like, I will go do X because I read your article, like knowing that this is part of the process and it's never going to be solved overnight. So just know that like in the depths of the badness, like part of like my job is to keep writing so people understand the stakes that they face.
Yeah, it does take a mental health toll. That's for sure. As I mentioned earlier, I went to the Marshall Islands a few years ago, and it's this incredible place in the Central Pacific, just north of the equator. And the US dropped 67 atomic bombs on it, on 2 of the atolls out there that I was fortunate enough and privileged enough to be able to visit. One of the wonderful things about these atolls is that nobody goes there because they're so irradiated. And that means that the coral is untouched, right? Boats don't go over it. People aren't fishing in there. People aren't diving. There isn't sunscreen coating it. And I went there and I was so excited to be in this place. And I went down with again, with Carolyn one day. It was a really hot day and everything was brown and cloudy, and the coral was dead. And I have to tell you, it was one of the most horrible experiences of my life. I came out and I think I cried for a couple of hours. But it was also complete motivation, right? To keep reporting, right? It's not okay. And sometimes getting really angry and really sad is the juice I need to keep working and to keep writing. So that's not very helpful, I know. But it's sort of how I manage those feelings, because I often see things that are really profound and disturbing, and the only way I can deal with it is if I feel like I'm doing something about it. So journalism does give me an outlet for it.
So our next question is from the same person, from Greg Peterson, and he has a very colorful metaphor that he uses to describe what he sees as the things that motivate people to make changes in their lives. The first being that they absolutely have to, and the second being that they realize that they should and they actually choose to. What do you think that you can do with your climate change journalism that might motivate people to choose to change either their approach to their lives, to the causes that they advocate for, the policymakers who are reading this coverage, maybe for them to change what they're advocating for and what they're hoping to accomplish in their careers? What power do you see the narratives that you're shaping and putting out into the world in playing in making people choose to pursue different paths in their lives that will hopefully lead to a better outcome for the climate. Maybe I'll start with Susanne and then go to Brian.
Yeah, so I mean, I think what I hope I'm doing with my reporting is I think I have a lot of faith in people that when they read, I mean, I said earlier, you know, climate change is so local now, right? It's happening to all of us. It's in our homes. But when they also read about sort of the impacts of climate and just how broad and how wide and how disparate the effects are, you know, they just think about this stuff every day. So when they do make choices, like when they pick a flight on Google, for instance, right, you can now see, like, is this Delta flight or is this United flight gonna produce less carbon, right? I mean, it's silly, it's gimmicky, but at the same time, you know, when you read about gray whales and there being no food for them up in the Arctic anymore because there's no sea ice, right? Or you hear about entire islands being consumed out in the Pacific, like, you realize every little thing you do has an impact, and we can all do this better if we just, you know, in these little things every day try. I guess that's where I hope I make an impact. And, you know, I also do hope that politicians are reading, that they're seeing these things. Again, with like the California gray whale, I hope the California politicians, I hope all of the people along the West Coast up into Alaska realize these iconic animals are you know, at risk of disappearing, and you know, status quo is no longer acceptable. Something needs to be done before, you know, these ecosystems completely collapse. And again, I also try to always make sort of it go full circle, that what we see happen, for instance, with animals, this isn't just out there and far away. It all comes back to us at some point. And so I try to make that circle sort of, again, visceral and emotional.
I think that's a big part of it. I also think, you know, there's a lot of value in telling stories. I mean, this is like, it's the kind of the journalistic grail, right, of like telling stories of like people like fighting against something bigger than themselves or whatever. But I do think that like when I'm able, like one of the story that I've probably gotten the most positive response to that I've ever written was this piece. It wasn't a climate story, but it was a conservation story about the quietest place in America, which is in the Hoh rainforest. And so I got a chance to get out there and visit it, and it is like absolutely spectacular. And in a very perverse world that we live in, it's also a place where the Navy has chosen to fly its loudest jets over as part of the Pacific Warfare Training Zone. Absolutely outlandish, and terrible for the people that live in the shadow of this you know, training zone as well. So, you know, it's not only assault on nature, but it's an assault on the folks that live there, essentially sonically. And so writing that piece and writing about the group of people that, you know, had come together to basically fight the Navy about this and about the stakes of it. I mean, like that really, I think, you know, it was extremely widely read. It was one of our most popular stories we've ever published. I got a lot of really positive feedback. And so to me, I think like that again speaks to this fact, you know, that it really is important. I think that there's a lot of importance in showing how people can come together to fight for a collective, something collectively better. And so that, you know, in terms of like inspiring folks and making sure they actually want to pursue the change, I mean, showing them that there are people already trying to do that is a great way to inspire other folks as well.
We're starting to get a lot more questions, and we only have a few more minutes left. So I'm just going to go to this one that's jumping out at me, which is, what has been the most personally impactful story that you've covered, and how did it affect your choices about how you live your daily lives? Maybe I'll start with Brian and then go to Susanne.
I mean, I'll just go back to that story about the Hoh rainforest. It was honestly one of the most moving things I've ever done. It just is a little more background on the space. It's called the 1 square inch of silence. This acoustic ecologist, Gordon Hempton, is the person that's kind of done these tests. And, you know, it's possible there may be quieter places in America elsewhere. He's kind of like does that, but it's kind of this symbolically powerful place. And it's amazing because in the middle of it, there just is this little red rock that's 1 square inch in size. And he changes it every time he goes to the place. And so he actually, you know, brings another red rock and puts in his place, grabs the other one. There's a whole backstory on it that you can read in the story that I wrote if you want to, but he gave me the rock from the place when we went out there, and it was really profound. And I mean, it personally made me think a lot more about, you know, my life, my choices, where I live, the things I deal with, the things I'm willing to put up with. I mean, I live in New York. extremely noisy. It's actually a miracle that a truck has not come like honking down the street, or a fire engine hasn't come by during this talk. But it made me really aware of the world around me, and not just, the toll that, air pollution and other things take, but noise pollution as well. And thinking about just like the bigger, like just the world in general, the things that we do know about that impact us, and actually the things we don't know. Like noise pollution is actually really poorly studied in terms of its impact on people and on the natural world. And so it just opened up a whole new way of thinking about like just all the ways that, not just pumping a bunch of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, but all the ways that human activity is actually having an impact on us. And in some ways, the dangers of the things that we don't know as well. So that certainly is one that's really stood out to me.
Yeah, and I'll go back to my experience in the Marshall Islands, going down, and coming up and just being distraught. I'm also a mother, and I have an incredible brood of 5 children. And I have to say, I think that experience changed the way I parent, in the sense that I have, I feel like we are, the planet is in a potential, we are in a crisis. So I have no patience, for instance, this is getting very personal, but my kids playing video games, right? They need to be spending their spare time reading and looking at the observable world, because that generation has to go out. If we can't fix it, they need to do it. So that experience profoundly changed me. It wasn't that I was like all about my kids doing video games before, but it has made me so much more aware of what young people need to be doing now, so that they can be there to help pick up the reins, which I hope we have done by that time. I hope we're handing off something better to them, but they're equipped and they're aware, and they also remember what this world looked like. And that spooks me, right? I mean, I think what was so profoundly upsetting to me was that I grew up looking at coral reefs. I've been scuba diving since I was a kid. I was so afraid my kids would never see the world I had seen. There is really something to be fighting for out there right now.
Well, we're about out of time. I'm going to ask one last very quick question, if you don't mind, and we've got about 5 minutes left. And that is, I assume that there are a number of people who are either watching this now or who might watch the recording that are interested in doing what you do, maybe in journalism, maybe in other modes of communication. But what advice do you have for people who want to tell stories about climate change, about how they should go about telling those stories? Maybe I'll start with Susanne and then go to Brian.
I mean, I think sort of the things Brian and I have both been saying is, if you're passionate about it, that's step number one, right? I have hired people in the past, and that, when I worked at Columbia University, those who seemed most passionate were people I tended to hire, because that sort of carries you through, particularly some really difficult reporting experiences. It also helps you through, some of the more dry reporting experiences, knowing that there's something good coming out of what you're doing. I also think, it sounds like both Brian and I came to journalism from different places. I don't know if I'm just talking to journalism students, but taking classes in other topics and other subjects, learning about conservation biology, learning about environmental engineering, learning about water, right? Try to make yourself, if not knowledgeable, a specialist on some of this stuff, because it comes through in the writing. I mean, again, as I was talking about earlier, when you write with authority, it really resonates with people. So the more you can understand and feel confident and authoritative in what you're writing, I think the better writing you will do, and therefore the better messaging and storytelling you will do as well.
Yeah, I mean, the passion part, I think, is step one. I think, the other big thing that I like to think about too, and I do this, so the students I teach, so it's called an MA in Climate Society. And so they're not journalists, right? But a big thing that is really important to me to impart to them from a journalism perspective is storytelling, and thinking about how to tell stories that you want to tell. I mean, that goes back to the passion, but I think it also speaks to the fact that, we know how the world works. And I think the older you get, and certainly the more you're like, well, this is just the way the world works. But I think that nothing is set in stone. Whether it's political systems, the energy system, fill in the blank system, like nothing has to be the way that it is today. And so when you're telling stories, I think it really helps to think, how do I wish we could see the world, or how do we change the things that aren't working? Having that view and being open to thinking about different perspectives of ways things can work, talking to sources who are thinking about things in radically different ways or incrementally different ways. If you're not ready to take like the radical route and don't want to report on that, I think like that to me is a really important part of thinking about how to get into this field and carve out an interesting niche, because the more folks we have thinking about things differently, the more exciting the stories are that we tell, and the more we sort of get society engaged in this story going forward.
Great, thank you for that. We're about out of time, so I just want to wrap up by first saying thank you, Susanne and Brian, so much for taking the time for this. It's been so fun asking you these questions, and I really appreciate you being so candid about your careers and your feelings about all these things. So thank you both so much. I also wanted to say thank you again to the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism, Mass Communication, and the Julie Ann Wrigley Global Futures Laboratory, and the Narrative Storytelling Initiative, all at Arizona State University, for helping us organize this. Thank you to Michelle Schwartz and Lauren QB, who are both here and have been really helpful in putting this together, as well as Stephen Veshlos. And thank you to our attendees for taking the time to come to this. Just so you all know, this is being recorded and will be made available. So if you want, you can watch it again, you can share it with others, and hopefully spread the word about our Covering Climate Change series, which this is the first event for, and there will be many more. So yeah, Susanne, Brian, thank you both again so much for making the time for this. It's been great talking to you.
Thank you for having us, or me. It really was a pleasure to be here, and I'm honored to be a part of it.
I'll add my thank yous too. It can be a thank you from us. This has been amazing.
All right, well, have a great rest of your day. Have a great weekend, and thank you for doing the work that you're doing.